Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make gluten-free ravioli. I use the same ingredients for all of the gluten-free pasta that I make, and I just adjust the amount of water based on what I'm going to be doing with the dough. For gluten-free pasta dough, I weigh out 185 grams of gluten-free all-purpose flour. This is just about 1 1/4 cup. After the flour is weighed out, I add 1 teaspoon of salt. I stir the flour and the salt together, and then I create a well in the dry mixture using a measuring cup or the back of a spoon. I crack 2 eggs into this well. Then I add 1 tablespoon of olive oil. I typically add about 1.5 tablespoons of water to the ravioli dough. This is because I don't handle the dough quite as much as I do when I make tortellinis, and because this shape is so simple, it doesn't dry out quite as fast. I whisk all of the liquid ingredients together and make sure that the eggs are well beaten. Then I gradually bring flour in from around the edges of the well. Once most of the flour is incorporated, I fully break the edges of the well and stir this together with a fork. I keep stirring this together until the dough is mostly come together. Then I turn it out onto a mat so that I can knead the dough. I knead the dough with my hands just to make sure that all of the ingredients are fully incorporated. I do like to knead the dough over a floured surface so that the dough won't stick to the mat. This is also a great time to check the consistency of the dough. It should be wet enough that it's easy to handle, but it shouldn't be so wet that if you just leave it to set on the mat for about 30 seconds, it starts to stick to the mat. If the dough is really sticking to the mat, you need to add more flour. Gluten-free noodle dough is really forgiving because we're able to work the dough as much as we need until it gets to the right consistency. Once the dough is mixed in well, I lightly sprinkle flour on the top and bottom of the dough, and then cover it in plastic wrap to chill in the fridge. Resting the dough in the fridge for 30 minutes to a full 24 hours is going to help the texture of the gluten-free dough. This allows time for the gluten-free flour to absorb the moisture from the water, egg yolks, and oil, which makes sure that we have a smooth texture instead of a gritty texture. While the dough is in the fridge, I like to make the filling. I typically don't measure these ingredients out, it's more about the ratio and flavor. I combine ricotta cheese, Parmesan cheese, and mozzarella cheese. Then I add garlic powder, onion powder, basil, oregano, thyme, salt, pepper, and red chili flakes. Then I mix everything together until it's well combined. I typically only make the filling within 30 minutes before I'm going to use the dough. To make the ravioli dough, I set up a mat with all of the ingredients or utensils that I'm going to need. I have a pasta roller, a container for flour, a container for water, my ravioli stamps, a plate to put the ravioli on, a measuring device for the ravioli filling, and a bench scraper to cut the dough. I cut the ravioli dough into 6 equal-sized pieces. I take one piece out to work with it first, and then wrap the other 5 back up in the plastic wrap. I work with this piece of dough over a bit of flour. I press the dough out flat with my hands so that it's thin enough that it will go into my pasta roller. You could also use a rolling pin to press this out flat. Once my pasta dough is thin enough, I make sure it's floured on both sides, and then I roll it through the pasta roller on the widest setting. I lay the dough out flat and check for any rips or tears. This piece looks good, so I adjust the pasta machine to one setting thinner. Then I run the pasta dough through the machine. It still doesn't have any rips or tears in the very center of the dough, so I set it one setting smaller again, and then run the dough through one final time. When I make just cheese ravioli, I like to size the dough down 3 times in total. However, I have experienced in the past that if I use beef or sausage in the ravioli, it can tear the dough at this thin of a setting. In this case, I like to only step the dough down 2 times. Once the sheet is rolled out, I like to score where the raviolis are going to be cut from to make sure I put the filling in the right place. Then I cut the dough in half so that the left half will be the bottom of the dough and the right half will go on top. I scoop 1 teaspoon of filling onto each of the 3 bottom pieces of ravioli. Then I pick up the top piece of dough and lay it over the filling. I use the Ravioli Stamp to press down and cut out the ravioli. The stamp that I'm using creates the ridges and also cuts it out. I save the scraps of the dough and combine it with the next batch of ravioli that I make. Then I place the ravioli onto a plate to make room for the next batch of dough. Now I'm going to speed the video up a little bit and talk about troubleshooting the dough, while also continuing to show how to make the gluten-free ravioli. There's two common reasons that the gluten-free dough might not be working well to make the gluten-free ravioli. One option is that the dough is too wet, and the other option is that the dough is too dry. The dough is too wet if it rips really easily and it just doesn't stay together to work with. The earlier on that I work with this dough, the wetter it tends to be, and by the time that I'm working on the very last batch of dough, it's dried out more. Because this is the second batch of dough that I'm working with, it is on the wetter side. It's much easier to dry out the dough by adding more flour than it is to make the dough more wet by adding more water. It's just harder to knead water into the dough. This is why I prefer to always start with a wetter dough than to start with a dry dough. Because this dough is on the wetter side, you can see where I have quite a few rips as it's rolling through the pasta machine. In these cases, I'm still able to get enough of a sheet out to create a ravioli, so I just toss those scraps to the side, and I plan to incorporate them in the next batch of dough that I work with. This way, I'll be able to add more flour to them, and they'll also be exposed to the air longer and dry out a little bit by the time I work with it again. As you can see in the video, I just combined one of those scraps of dough with the next batch. This is actually the very last batch of dough that I have left. In this case, the scraps of dough was quite a bit drier than the dough that I had kept in the plastic wrap, so I had to knead them together and make sure that everything was still evenly mixed. Once it was kneaded together well, I ran it through the pasta maker the same way as usual. The other potential issue with gluten-free pasta dough is if the dough is too dry. In this case, the dough is going to be very difficult to work with, and it won't roll through the pasta machine easily. It tends to bunch up on the top of the rollers and just separate instead of go through the rollers. The easiest way that I've found to fix dough that's too dry is to put a little bit of water onto my hands and then knead the dough. I continue adding a little bit of water onto my hands and then kneading the dough until the dough gets to a consistency that it's easy to work with again. This process is a lot more trial and error and takes longer to get right than it does just adding flour into the dough to make it drier. This is why I always prefer having a dough that's too wet rather than a dough that's too dry. Once all the ravioli has been made, you can cook it fresh, or you can put it in the freezer to cook later. To cook it fresh, boil a pot of water and then add the raviolis in. Cook the raviolis for 6 to 8 minutes or until it's to the doneness that you like. Once the raviolis are done, coat it in your sauce and enjoy. Thanks for watching this video on how to make gluten-free ravioli. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.